Sorry, John, we just need to unmute you. There we go, perfect.
Hello everyone, on behalf of the Australia-Israel Chamber in Western Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all here to this very special geopolitical webinar after the war was over, with former Israel Ambassador to Australia, Mr Mark Sofer, and supported today by former West Australian Governor, Malcolm McCusker. In his address today, Mark will be sharing perspectives on the immediate and longer-term ramifications of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has been raging now for 22 weeks since 24 February this year. We have an amazing online audience attending today with people in Western Australia, the eastern states of Australia, Asia, Israel, of course, USA, and in Europe. So thank you all for joining us, and a deep appreciation in advance to both our presenters, Mark Sofer, who is in Israel, and Malcolm McCusker, who's in Perth. May I acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land upon which we are meeting today, and in the spirit of reconciliation, we pay respect to the elders past and present and emerging leaders. This event today is special. It continues the long tradition of AICC's geopolitical events, and usually anchored by Gregory Copley, who is known to many of you attending today. Just some acknowledgements. Today's webinar is supported by Mr. Ian Green, also AICC board member for over 20 years, Mr. John Schaefer, AM, and plus the Chamber's platform partner for all our webinars is kindly provided by this boutique strategic investor and media relations agency called Chapter 1 Advisors, courtesy of David Tasker. On behalf of Graham Late and the board of AICC, plus the entire Chamber community now able to watch from anywhere in the world, sincere appreciations for your loyalty and support, everyone. To moderate today's session, we're honoured to have prominent Perth barrister and philanthropist, and who was the 31st Governor of WA, His Excellency, Malcolm McCusker, AC. Malcolm is an AICC member and regular attendee at our geopolitical events established by Harold Clough and Greg Copley in 2016. Malcolm will moderate today by providing a brief commentary on his observations of the topic and comments on Mr. Sofer's presentation, and then offer questions to Mr. Sofer. Instructions for all of you out there to submit your questions, please. If you have a question, submit them using the Q&A form on the screen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce and then hand over to Mark. So for you who haven't read the invitation properly, you'll know that until 2 years ago, Mark was a career was the ambassador in Israel in Australia for Israel. Is a 45-year veteran in the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, completing his posting in Australia in August 2020. Mark received his BA in Economics and International Relations from London School of Economics, and he took on an MA in Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Following his studies, he performed his military service before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His distinguished career with the ministry has seen him posted to Peru, Norway, New York, before being appointed as ambassador to Ireland, and later as ambassador to India, and concurrently non-resident ambassador to Sri Lanka. His career also spans acting as policy advisor to the then foreign minister for Israel, Shimon Peres, and heading a prestigious non-for-profit organization, the Jerusalem Foundation. So before his posting in Australia, Mark served as Deputy Director General of Foreign, the Ministry, and Head of Asia Pacific Division. So thank you, Mark, for creating time to present in the morning for you in Israel, and we're very much looking forward to your views and commentary. So now, Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and everybody, and of course, Governor Malcolm, for being here. It's a pleasure, even only on Zoom, to be back again in Perth. I loved every visit I had there. It's a place which is very close to my heart, and it's wonderful at least to be here like this. Now, I think if I might, it's probably a little bit presumptuous of me to talk about the global economic repercussions of the war in Ukraine in front of this illustrious audience, in front of all of you business community people, because probably you know much more about the ramifications and repercussions than I do in the global sphere. And of course, talking of course about the implications of the rise in the cost of fossil fuels, of wheat, the effect on international air transport, the ramifications for Europe due to dependency on Russian gas, etc. So what I'd like to do more is to put the emphasis on what this war, or as the Russians for some reason tend to call, for their reasons, tend to call the operation, or the military, special military operation, but what it means for Israel and how we're attempting to tackle it, and frankly to ask the question, have we been successful and in doing so? Now, I would, however, like to start with some general remarks on the topic of after the war is over, which is, of course, the headline or the heading of this seminar, this webinar, on a more general plane, and to look at the question, really, will Russia lose this war? Now, the Talmud, which is, of course, the ancient Jewish tractate, says that, teaches us that since the destruction of the temple, prophecy has been the domain of fools and children. And to be honest with you, I'm not a child anymore, so I obviously fit into the first category. But I'm going to have a guess at, or some sort of speculative approach to that. Now, at the risk of sounding a little bit controversial, I would stress that in the eyes of Putin and in Russia in general, not only will Russia not lose this war under any circumstances, but in certain respects, in their eyes at least, it's already won the war. And there are probably three factors involved in this. I think, number one, unless he's completely overthrown, which seems extremely unlikely and improbable at best, an autocrat like Putin never actually would lose a war like this, despite the massive loss of life, the attack on his economy, the international sanctions. Putin, let's not forget, wields more power than any other Russian leader ever, or even Soviet leader, I would say, perhaps with the exception of Stalin. There's no opposition. There's no one he's responsible to or answerable to, like Politburo or something like that. And at the end of the day, his inner circle, besides the inner circle, I would say nobody really has a clue in Russia what's actually going on. And so he cannot and will not, in his eyes, in the eyes of Russia, lose this, because it's not a possibility. It's not something that he will sell his people. It's not something that he actually believes in himself. Secondly, I would say that the reason that he won't lose the war is that we don't actually know what winning the war means. It's impossible to know what his aims are. Is it the collapse of Ukraine? Is it the fall of the Zelensky government? Is it capturing the entire country, or capturing just eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, Donbass, or whatever? And if and when the war ends, I would say when more than if, at some stage it will end, I can simply say, he will simply say, well, I achieved all the aims, I achieved all my goals anyway, simply because nobody knows what those goals are right now. And he has only elaborated it to himself. So he said, I achieved what I really set out to do. But in one respect, as I say, in Russian eyes and in Putin's eyes, when we're talking, say, about NATO, in his eyes, he's already won this war. Now, I tell you a story about how, and I used to be Deputy Director General, head of the Russia and Eastern Europe division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, something which might illustrate this a little bit in your eyes. And usually it's told about America, but since we're talking to an audience in Perth and West Australia, I'll adapt it to you. Now, the story goes, it's not, of course, a true story, but it's a joke goes, that a man was driving down, let's say, the Mitchell Freeway, heavy with traffic, couldn't move, couldn't budge, he really needed to get some medicine, some tablets, and he saw a chemist on the side, stopped his car, he said, listen, I've got to stop, I know I'm taking the risk of getting a ticket, a parking ticket, but I need to get this medicine right quite urgently, I'll take that risk. He goes, he stops his car on the side of the road in the middle of all the traffic, goes inside, picks up the medicine, comes outside, yes, he's got a ticket. 3 minutes, but he got a ticket, $200, and he's really angry with himself. I should never have done this, but nonetheless, I did it, and now I have to pay for it. 6 months down the line, same guy driving down the Mitchell Freeway again, same problem. He's driving, he's got massive traffic, he needed this medicine urgently. He said, I know I got this ticket last time, $200, it was a stupid thing to do, but I have to do it again anyway, because I've got no other choice, I just have to go and do it. He goes in, and it doesn't matter whether he gets ticket or not, he gets ticket, and that's it. What happens in Russia on such an event? At such an event, a guy is driving down Moscow on Tverskaya Street, which is the main road of Moscow, which some of you might know. And again, chock-a-block with traffic. He stops off, he sees a chemist, he needs this medicine, he stops, he gets out the car. I'm going to get a ticket, but I might get a ticket, but I've got to go and get this medicine. He goes in, takes his medicine, comes out again. Yes, he's got a ticket. But not only has he got his ticket, his windscreens have been smashed, his tires have been completely slashed, his engine has been pulled out of the car. And I promise you one thing, in 6 months' time, he will never go back to the same chemist. He will never ask to take a medicine down to Tverskaya Street as well. Now, if we adapt that to present day, that's the way a lot of the way Russians thinking. We remember it some years back in Georgia, when the Georgians said the Abkhazia region was theirs, and Russian troops just entered Tbilisi, and that was the end of the Georgians saying that South Ossetia or Abkhazia at the time was theirs. Now, if we're looking now, I can guarantee one thing, or Putin will guarantee one thing. In fact, I think the world has guaranteed one thing. Even when the war is over, it'll be another 30 to 50 years at least until Ukraine starts talking again about NATO, or until NATO starts talking about Ukraine. Whatever happens, that I think attempt to let Ukraine join NATO, talk about even Ukraine joining NATO, that's already off the table. And in his eyes, therefore, in Putin's eyes, therefore, he's won this war. Now, if we drill down to Israel and to where we stand on here, I would say that when the war broke out, I think that almost every country in the world knew that it was going to suffer. They were going to suffer economically, on the governmental level. They were certainly going to suffer from the company or industry level, and the multinational concerns, all the work going on all the activities going on in Russia, on that part of the world. But I do believe that not a single Western democracy, not one, found itself in a more impossible situation than Israel when this war broke out. It was we knew from the stage one that we were going to come out of this not unscathed, but highly scathed, if you can say that. There was no way that we would come out of this as we were before, or like other democratic Western countries. Australia, Canada, America, etc., will come out just with some sort of economic hardships, but we knew that it was going to be worse for us for a number of reasons, and we also knew that we were going to be in an impossible situation. Now, why are we in an impossible situation? But clearly, from a moral, from a humanitarian approach, there is absolutely no daylight between the way that we view the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the Russian war in Ukraine, and the way the entire Western world sees the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States, Australia, etc. It's a terrible humanitarian tragedy. It should never have taken place morally, value-wise. It's one of the worst things that should ever have happened, completely unnecessary. And we're looking at the terrible loss of life terrible loss of limb and refugee crises all over that area, but not only there. Clearly on a moral and value-based level, we're on exactly the same page. However, the impossible situation we found ourselves in really relates to two separate issues which have nothing to do with the war itself, which actually attack our national security, our deep national, inherent national interests, and on two planes. The first plane, I would say, would be that of the Jewish communities of Russia, and to a certain extent in Ukraine. Now, there are about 150,000 Jews in both. It's very difficult to know the numbers because it depends on what is classified as a Jew. In certain communities, a father, and certain communities, a mother. But nonetheless, the figures vary between 100 to about 300,000 or 400,000 each. And both, frankly, have quite a long history. I hate to say this, but it has to be said, a long history of anti-Semitism. We still harbor the not distant fear of what could be done to the Jews, especially of Russia, were Israel to make its values and its exactly equal to its activity. In other words, were we to take entirely, as Australia has, as the West has, the viewpoint of Ukraine and how we feel, then clearly enormous damage would be done to the Jewish community of Russia. We remember clearly under the Soviet Union, as I said, there were how they hampered the Jewish life there. No schools, no synagogues, no community centers, no emigration. They were downtrodden. Terrible anti-Semitism, as I said. I should open parentheses here and say that Putin, and I've met him on a number of occasions when he was kosher. Putin doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. He is not an anti-Semite. He might be the only one there, but he's not an anti-Semite. I can't say that about many of the others. We saw, for example, Lavrov, the foreign minister, who clearly and openly and reprehensibly said, Ukraine is a Nazi state. It's full of neo-Nazis. Zelensky is Jewish. And when he was asked on Italian television not so long ago, what does that mean? He said, well, even Hitler, how can he said, he was asked, how is it possible that Zelensky can be a Nazi, that the Ukraine, because Zelensky is Jewish? And he said, well, even Hitler had Jewish blood. This was Lavrov, the foreign minister, not just some sort of peasant in northern Siberia. And of course, this is one of the most famous anti-Semitic tropes, that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust and that they actually caused it on themselves and all that type of elders of Zion type of idiocy. Now, this type of thinking, Putin semi-apologized in a private conversation he had with the Israeli president, but nonetheless, this is a lot of the type of thinking that's going on. And if that's the type of thing that's going on, we're very fearful about what might happen or might occur to the Jewish community in Russia. And as a matter of fact, and I can come back to that later, the Jewish agency activity inside of Russia today is already being called into question. We just have a delegation which went last night to Moscow to speak to the security and the legal people there, because the Russians are threatening to close down all the activities of the Jewish agency in Russia. So we're very, very fearful indeed about the possibility of what Russia might and can do to the Jewish community. There are a few 100,000, as I said, and had we completely gone hook, line, and sinker for the Ukraine's position, which is where we feel and where we're coming from, this would have exacerbated enormously the problems for the Jewish community in Russia. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, in some respects, no easier, is the issue of Syria. Now, I was taught when I was little, and especially in the foreign ministry, never use bombastic statements, never say something which can be, can't be muted, always say things in a sort of diluted way, etc. But I honestly believe, we all honestly believe here, it's pretty much consensual in Israel, that the issue of Syria and what's going on in Syria is actually pretty much existential. And I use that word not lightly, existential for the state of Israel. We find ourselves in a situation where we have a country on our northern border, literally overlooking us, in which there is a civil war raging for almost a decade, or for about a decade. About 1 million people have been killed, and the players there, now that the American troops have left, Trump, as you remember, withdrew American troops mainly from Syria. We have a murderous Syrian regime. We have any number of ISIS and Al-Qaeda militias working there, with him, against him, but nonetheless. We have, perhaps worst of all, Iranian boots on the ground. I'm going to remind you all here that Iran is a country dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. Boots on the ground, meaning there are Iranian troops there, there are Iranian weaponry there, etc. And this is the quagmire of Syria, literally a few kilometers up the road from here. So the only responsible adult that is active there, as far as we can work with, is Russia. There is no other, I mean, were Russia not there, from our point of view, the country would be in a state of total collapse, the Iranians would take over, and we will find ourselves under nuclear threat, possible nuclear threat on our immediate northern border. And this relationship, therefore, with Russia, as far as we're concerned, has taken on geostrategic implications, the likes of which I think no other country in the world can even possibly believe. We must continue to have a good relationship with Russia. We have to continue to work with Russia to allow us to prevent Iranian and Syrian arms from reaching the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which again is attacking us from there, sometimes turning a blind eye, certainly almost always working closely with the Russians on what's happening in Syria, coordinating with them as much as we possibly can. And a dilapidation, a collapse of our relationship with Russia would literally has the potential, let's say, don't want to go too far, of being existential for the state of Israel. So all of this, these two major points, they play against our moral, or what we would like to be, is our moral values and our moral, and where we believe, what we believe should happen in the Ukraine-Russia war. We are basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, and an impossible situation which no other country in the world is in. Of course, we all suffer the economic implications, but these two additional facets place us in a place where we really found it impossible. So how have we tried to deal with it? We tried to deal with it in a number of different ways. How do you dodge bullets? How do you run between the bullets without getting hit? How do you run between raindrops without getting wet? It's very, very difficult, a diplomatic challenge, the likes of which is I don't envy anyone who has to go through that. So we've tried, first of all, on the general terms. We vote always in the United Nations, international fora, voting with the West, voting with what we believe in, which is basically almost always been against Russia, always actually been against Russia. We voted with that, but we've been very, very careful not to use terminology in our statements, especially official statements. You're talking about war crimes or criminals, or Russia is, language which would exacerbate Russian-Israeli fears or a deterioration in Russian-Israeli relations. We've been very careful with that. However, the voting patterns have been with the West. We've played what I can say is the good cop, bad cop approach. We had, as we know, I'll get back to that in a moment about the government in Israel, but we had a two-headed government just until very recently. Prime Minister Bennett, who is now resigned or was actually ousted, more or less, to all intents and purposes, and the bad cop, Lapid. Bennett was very, very close with the Russians, and tried to engage with them, never called them names, never was very, very careful, very open with them, and very good with them. Lapid, the foreign minister, who is now prime minister, was much more open. He talked about the disgrace that Russia is doing, etc. Basically a good cop, bad cop type of approach, where each one could quote each side, the Western side, or we could quote to the Western side or to the Russian side whichever we wished. Basically playing and I say this openly, a dual game here. There was no choice, trying to be good and bad for both sides. Trouble is now, of course, that Bennett is no longer there, so we've got only Lapid, who's the prime minister. He's been very strong on Russia, and it's going to be more difficult to handle now. To a certain extent, the president of Israel, Herzog, has stepped in to try and be the good cop, to try and help relations with Russia, but nonetheless, it's going to be more difficult. And the third way we've tried to tackle this impossible situation that we found ourselves in was attempts at mediation. Now, it wasn't a cynical attempt. These have not been cynical attempts at mediation. They've been serious attempts at mediation. Bennett, as you know, was in Russia, was in Moscow, was in Ukraine. We've been in constant contact with them, countless phone calls with Zelensky and with Putin. But frankly, it wasn't cynical, but it had little chance of success. So certainly at the early stages of the war, Putin wasn't really interested and still isn't interested in finishing it until some stage or another. But what happened with this mediation process is it basically calmed everybody down. The Americans took the pressure off us by saying, of course, how on earth can we expect you to have a deterioration, dilapidation of relations with Russia at the same time as you're trying to mediate? The minute if you're the enemy, you can't mediate. The Ukrainian leadership said exactly the same to us. In fact, Zelensky appeared on Israeli television. He spoke before the Knesset a number of times. It was not very easy conversations, but he did understand that if we found ourselves with the fight against Russia, we would not be able to try to do any type of mediation. And so, and of course, Putin the same. You can't be 100% pro-Russia if you are trying to get us to move together. Bottom line, all of that was that the mediation process did enable us at least to buy time, but to keep everybody not happy. I would say unhappy, but not too unhappy. Not so unhappy that everything would fall apart and we would be faced with these two difficulties that I mentioned earlier, which was, of course, the Jewish communities on the one hand and Syria on the other. So have we succeeded? Well, we've certainly succeeded in getting everybody angry with us. That's for certain. We knew that was going to happen, but I don't think anyone is, as I said earlier, too angry. We're still, we're not good boys and girls. We're still, naughty children. But nonetheless, it hasn't reached the level of, why, my goodness, you're a disaster, you're a disgrace, you're Iran, you're China, nothing on that. The Americans have reduced the pressure because they realize the situation we're in. The Europeans have done as well. But have we succeeded in the long term? I think it's too early to say. There's a lot of worrying signs which worry us enormously. I spoke about the Jewish Agency. Now, we know full well that the Russian claims of why they have to close down the Jewish Agency activities in Russia for legal reasons, for the working with the Jewish communities, they are not always with the collusion of the Russian authorities, etc. It's got nothing to do with the Jewish Agency. It's clearly a political decision. It's either got to do with the disaffection with what we're doing in Syria, working against the movement of armaments, against the Iranian troops, etc., on the one hand, or what they are seeing more and more is Israeli support for Ukraine. And so this Jewish Agency business clearly is one of them. Another problem, I don't know if it was reported highly in Australia, it was certainly reported highly here in Israel, that Putin just went to Iran, together actually with the Turkish, with Erdogan, ostensibly to talk about Syria, but clearly they were talking about other things as well, the war, armaments, Iranian, and this movement of Russia towards Iran is very troubling for us, very worrying indeed, because as I said, Iran has been since the rise of the Ayatollahs, and certainly continues to be today, absolutely existential with their attempt to achieve nuclear weapon capability to use against Israel. So it's too early to say whether we've been successful, but I will say that even the 5 months, John mentioned earlier, the 220 days or whatever, I can't remember how many days, it's certainly, it's about 5 or 6 months until the war started. We are scathed, as I said earlier, but not, we're not in a tragic situation. We've managed somehow to maneuver ourselves in the eyes of many. Of course, it plays into Israeli politics, which I'll come to now, and with that I'll finish. But we haven't really fallen apart at the seams. We haven't seen the whole world coming down on us like a ton of bricks. The Russians are still upset, but not too upset, as I said. Ukraine and the West the same, and we're still managing to forge this path. The longer the war goes on, the harder it'll be until it reaches a stage of impossibility, and we will have to choose a side. When we do choose sides, clearly what side it will be the Ukraine side, clearly, but we have to, of course, be able to manage what was going to happen with the Jewish community in Russia on the one hand, and with the Syrian issue on the other. Now, and with this I'll finish, but I'd be happy to answer questions on it. The last ramification for Israel is, of course, something which plagued us for the last few years, and that is the political instability that we've been facing. I think we're proof of the adage that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Clearly, as we approach our 5th general election in about 2.5 years, and not many people will change. It's very likely there's going to be a 6th, etc. We're going to be playing here weak governments, coalition governments which can't really function or take decisions of major proportion, and the country is in turmoil as far as its internal politics is concerned. Now, with the rise of inflation, with the cost of living, the petrol, electricity, bread, which has affected all of us, of course, and maybe not so much in Australia because you have your own, but here, certainly in this part of the world, it has. It's become the major issue right now, as we are 2.5 months away from the elections, something like that. It's become a major issue in the campaign process. People are not sophisticated. They go to the supermarket, they look at the prices, they see they're going up. They don't start thinking in terms of Ukraine war. They don't start thinking in terms of transport of wheat or of energy. They start saying, why am I paying so much? And of course, the opposition, Netanyahu, is playing into that. And we find, therefore, that the war internally, like everything in Israel, has already it's already beginning to have an effect. And this is, I think, will continue to be the case unless the government will find a way to explain, which is not easy to the masses, actually, about why the cost of living in Israel is going up, and it's no different from anywhere else in the world. This doesn't, but it's a very difficult sell, and we'll have to see how they can handle that. But the weakness of the Israeli political system, of democracy here, not the democracy is extremely strong. I'm talking about of the political stability here will continue, I believe. And the war in Ukraine will not help us or not to overcome this in any way whatsoever. Those are some of my thoughts, really. I don't know how long it's been. I think it was Abba Eban, who was an Israeli foreign minister, who once said he doesn't mind when he talks if people look at their watches. He doesn't even mind if they take their watches off and shake them next to their ears to see if the watches are still going. He begins to get very worried if they take out their diaries to see if we're still on the same day. So since I don't know if any of you have done that, but I think I've probably spoken for too long anyway. So I'll stop there and be happy to take any questions that any of you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Now over to Malcolm for a comment.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you, Mark. It was a most interesting discourse that you've given us. You began, of course, by talking about the unlikelihood. In fact, I think you're saying impossibility of Ukraine talking about NATO, whatever the outcome of this war may be. It has, of course, been accepted as a candidate for European Union. I wonder whether that candidacy will go ahead, or whether that too is going to fall into the same problem that they have talking of NATO with Russia. You've explained to us, I think, very clearly the kind of situation that Israel is in. It's, as they say, it's between a rock and a hard place, because it clearly has two good reasons, as you explained, for not wanting to get totally offside with Russia. One being the latent anti-Semitism that you've mentioned that exists not only in Russia but also in the Ukraine. And indeed, I understand that the Ukrainian front in the eastern part of Ukraine is extremely anti-Semitic. It's a body which could be well likened, as indeed Putin has, to Nazism, because it is so extremely right-wing and anti-Semitic. So it can well be understood that there's a concern that getting offside with Russia may ultimately cause a backlash against the Jewish population of both Russia, which is quite a large population, and indeed in Ukraine. And the second point that you've made, of course, is a very important one, and that is the reliance that Israel has on Russia as its presence in Syria. Without Russia being in Syria, there's every chance, it would appear, that the Syrians will assist even more and more the Iranians who are already there. My understanding, and you might, in responding, mention this, my understanding is that there is a kind of an accord, it's not a written accord, but an accord so far between Russia and Israel, whereby Russia does not prevent Israel passing across Syria, which the airspace of which is not legally but practically covered by Russia, in the course for the purpose of preventing supply of arms from Lebanon. I think the Hezbollah are trying all the time to provide arms to the Syrians and the Iranians. So there seems to have been, up until recently, some kind of an unwritten, indeed perhaps unspoken accord with Russia that allows the Israeli planes to fly across that for that purpose. It is the case, of course, as you mentioned, that Israel has shown that it is totally pro-West as far as its views on this war go. It's voted twice in the UN. I think one of the 140 UN members that voted strongly back in March of this year, a resolution condemning Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine, even though Russia calls it a special military operation, and voted again to expel Russia from the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. And it has provided some limited succor or support to Ukraine, in the sense that it's provided, I think, a field ambulance and provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine, I should say, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But there have been many voices raised about Israel not doing more. For example, I understand that there was a strong push at one stage, perhaps it's died down now, for Israel to provide its Iron Dome defense against missiles. And more recently, there's been talk of the iron, I'm not sure what the name is, but it's another weapon or defense, I should say, against other forms of attack. Coming to you mentioned the problem within Israel. I know that there's been a very strong, overwhelming support for Ukraine in votes that have been taken in Israel. Something over 80% were in favour of Ukraine in this war against Russia. But that's as far as it's gone, I think. You referred to the good cop. I think that was Mr. Bennett, who was the previous PM of Israel, and the bad cop, Lapid, who is the kind of interim PM until the 1st of November, at which point there's to be a general election in Israel, and Mr. Netanyahu may then put his hand up. In fact, almost certainly will, I would think. And Mr. Netanyahu had a very good relationship once with Russia, so much so that on his previous election campaign, he had pictures posted of himself shaking hands with Putin. Well, that was before the war, of course. The attempts to, can I come from that kind of summary to a couple of questions? Is Israel now still trying to mediate? Has it been successful at all? Do you think that it might still have the opportunity to do so, given the situation that's arisen in the last few weeks, I think, with the Jewish agency being being threatened with closure by Moscow? And that Jewish agency has been set up, been there for some time, to assist people of Jewish descent to assist them to emigrate to Israel. And that's under threat. And as you say, it's a political action. There are allegations by Russia that the Jewish agency has committed all kinds of misdeeds, but the reality is that it's using political pressure. So with that context, and with the so-called bad cop Lapid at the moment, the Prime Minister, and one who has been prepared to speak out very strongly against Russia, unlike the good cop, his predecessor, do you think there's any prospect still of a mediation being successful on the part of Israel with Russia, or is that now no longer a prospect? And if so, if that's no longer a prospect, we're really left with the other 2 points you mentioned, the concern about anti-Semitism and the Syria problem, as you put it. But I'd like to thank you very much already for what you've provided in your discourse, because it's certainly given me, and I'm sure everyone else, great food for thought.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. If I can make a few points very quickly on what you've said. First of all, yes, I think there is a big difference between the EU and NATO. I'm certainly not going to be an apologist for the Russian regime, for Putin and for the regime, but NATO is a military alliance dedicated against Russia. I think the fear is not so much the EU, which is more of a political nature or economic nature, rather than NATO, which is, and Ukraine being for Russia, the buffer zone, as it were, between Russia and large parts, well, sort of NATO. If you remember at the very beginning of the 2000s, when the Yeltsin was in power, he was a bit of a buffoon, Yeltsin, as we all know, drank a little bit too much, etc. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia all joined NATO. And he didn't notice that was happening. I mean, the EU wasn't the problem; it was NATO, and that's why he is. So they are so, I would say, hell-bent on stopping NATO, on stopping Ukraine joining NATO. And frankly, I'll be honest, I think it's pretty much off the cards. I don't think it's going to be back on the cards again in the next period, even were I to be totally wrong and Putin would lose the war in every way. Yes, I think that that's not going to happen again, because no Russian government at all will be able to get a deal with the Ukraine inside of NATO, and so it'll just rekindle everything that we've seen again. Now, Syria, onto that. Syria is, to all intents and purposes, as unfortunately it's not the only one, but it's a failed state. It's a state which really, I would say, Assad has control of himself, of Damascus, and probably that's about it. And without Russia, he wouldn't be there at all. It's a country which is dilapidated into a non-country. It's not the only one in the Middle East, incidentally. We see it in Yemen. We see it to a large extent in Lebanon. We saw it in Iraq until recently, even till today. It's not an uncommon, unfortunately, process, but Syria is for us the biggest fear, given that it's literally on our border, and given that the Iranians dedicated to our destruction are actually there, as I said earlier. Do we have an agreement with Russia? You know, I'll be a little bit circumspect here, if I might, and to say that we deal with, as I mentioned in my words, I chose them quite carefully. I think the word coordination is probably better than agreement. I think the understanding that we cannot allow the facilitation of movement of weaponry, anti-aircraft missiles, not just anti-aircraft missiles, which the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which clearly they have somewhere in the region of 100,000 of them, which can reach all parts of Israel. The continuation of the transfer of weaponry from Iran via Syria into Lebanon. We'd have two fronts, not just the one potential front of Syria. So we have to work closely with the Russians. We do coordinate with them. Are they happy? Of course they're not. In fact, they've been very strong and critical about Israeli airstrikes but as long as it's in Syria, but as long as it's at the level of polemic, we can handle that. They haven't yet said, under no circumstances will this continue, and I hope that we actually reach that. A word or two about the assistance. We've done we're not a major player in the international arena, but we did actually provide a huge field hospital to Ukraine. Not just ambulances, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians used it. It was on the border between Ukraine and Poland, and it was very much used by injured and wounded Ukrainian civilians it's now been recalled about 2 weeks ago, I think, or 10 days ago to Israel because it outlived its worth there. But I think it was quite a large amount. We're not supplying weaponry. That's true. And you're correct there. There were requests from Ukraine to supply the Iron Dome. There were requests from Ukraine to supply drones, etc. But this is exactly the problem that we found ourselves in, as I revert to being caught between the rock and the hard place. What do you do with weaponry? Once you start supplying weapons, you are immediately compromising the two problems that I was speaking about earlier, which is the Jewish communities the Jewish communities in Ukraine and Russia, and the Jewish community and the Syrian issue. Anti-Semitism continues massively. It's actually, I hate to say this, if any of you have been to Kiev, if you go, there's the biggest statue in the middle of town of Kiev, which is a beautiful city, incidentally, is of somebody called Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Bogdan Khmelnytsky is probably he was a Cossack leader. He certainly was an anti-Semite of the Hitler. I actually hate comparing anything to Nazism or to Hitler. I never think it's a good idea. It's always a bad idea. But in his case, his ideology was completely Nazi, and wiping out the Jewish community, destroying, etc. And none of that statue in the middle of Kiev still there. It's very sad to see. It would be nice if they would take it down, but they haven't. And of course, Russia, as I said earlier, with the problems that we have there. I don't think that the mediation attempts have been successful. I'm not convinced that they will continue. I think there are probably better actors in the international arena, India, for example, or others that can play a better role than we can, especially with the political instability inside of Israel. It's very difficult indeed, because if somebody like Lapid would try again to take on this mediation role and would fail, he would give fodder and food for the opposition in Israel. Look, you tried to be an international statesman, of course you failed completely. Only Netanyahu can do that, etc., etc., etc. So I think there's everything plays in and plays out of the internal political situation right now. However, I also don't think that the mediation succeeded, basically because Russia wasn't ready for any type of mediation, and probably still isn't. Otherwise, there would be other actors that would step in as well. At the time, it was a good policy, it was a good strategy. I don't really see it continuing. But again, I'm not 100% on board on that one.
No. Thank you for that. Can you hear me? Hello? No.
Yes.
You can. Good. I have a question that's been sent to me, I think, from one of the audience, and that is, do you think that there will be a first phase? It's hard to say what that might be. A first phase when perhaps the first phase of this war in Ukraine will come to an end, and there'll be time where Russia will say, well, we've achieved what we want to achieve, whatever that may have been, and pull out, leaving Ukraine, or will it simply seek to achieve total dominance over Ukraine?
Well, this brings me back to my earlier statement about being the fool rather than the child. I think that I don't think anybody really knows. The unknown is much more prevalent than the known at this stage. I think when Putin has decided that I don't want any more, it's causing too much damage, or just say, okay, we've achieved our aims and we're out of here. I don't think he'll ever get completely out of there, to be honest with you. I think he'll always stay in the eastern part of Ukraine, where the pro-Russian militias are, in Donbass and the Luhansk, as he did in Crimea, as we know a few years back. And for that reason, I don't think that we're ever going to see, or for a long period of time, we're going to see Ukraine reverting back to what it actually was as far as its territorial integrity is concerned. However, that stage will come when Putin decides it comes, for good and for bad.
Yes. There's time for another question or two before we close. Are there any more coming from the audience, David? No. As far as I can gather, I got that question sent to me by email. So it's can I ask just one further question, and that relates to the provision of, you might say, a refuge or safe haven for some of the Russian oligarchs. There was some criticism leveled, I think by Biden, in fact, at Israel for allowing some of the so-called Russian oligarchs having a safe haven in Palestine, in Israel, including, I think, Abramovich, the well-known Abramovich, who, having got safe haven, attempted to assist in the mediation attempts, but got nowhere. Is Israel addressing that problem, if it is a problem?
Yeah, the question of the oligarchs has been a legal problem inside of Israel, because some of them have, as Abramovich is one of them, have Israeli citizenship. So yes. While we're part and parcel of the international sanctions on these people, we can't stop citizens from coming into the country, as no country citizens coming in. However, we found very quickly on a legal method of doing so. We dissuaded them in nice terms. Of course, we don't use the other type of activity. Their flights weren't allowed in. They weren't allowed to continue to do any type of economic activity or commercial activity inside of Israel. And generally speaking, that problem we had at the very beginning, which was the oligarchs, or some of the oligarchs, Abramovich is, of course, the prime one that we know. He's very close to Putin, but he's certainly not the only one. Having Israeli citizenship, and how do we place sanctions on people who've got actually could sit here and do their work? But we have found a way out of it. That problem doesn't exist anymore. They've been, their entire activity has been curtailed. None of them are here right now. And as far as I know, none of them can come in right now either. But certainly we're not hearing any flack. We're not getting any more flack like we did at the very beginning on that problematic legal front.
I've just been sent, thank you very much. I've been just sent one further very simple question, which is, what can Australians learn about regional diplomacy from Israel, given the conflicts that have occurred around Israel for many years, especially given the perceived rise of conflict in the APAC region? That's a simple one.
A simple one. That's a one-sentence answer. If you give me 3 weeks, I'll get through that answer to that question.
Exactly.
But I'll try and be very. I'll try and be very brief. First of all, under no circumstances will I try even attempt to say what Australia can or cannot learn from Israel. Australia is a country which I think we can learn much more from it than it can from us. But I think that one of the biggest issues that we face here, having said everything that I said, at the end of the day, with the humanitarian tragedy that's unfolding there, with the economic crisis that's not only affecting Russia and Ukraine, especially Russia, etc., war can never be on its own a solution to anything. And I think we realize that more and more in the Middle East. We're not always happy with that, with what our governments do. Certainly the Palestinians and the Arab world is not always happy, as we saw recently in the Arab Spring, and etc. Sometimes there has to be conflict, sometimes there has to be military conflict, but there has to be an additional, must be. The only way is an additional path forward, talk, discussion, negotiation, compromise, which is the order of the day, etc. And it does, we feel, work. I won't get involved now in the Abraham Accords, but our relationship with much of the Arab world is as good as better than any other part of the world today. Certainly some of the Gulf countries, certainly Morocco, Egypt, and even Jordan. Lapid was in Jordan last night, actually, and sat with the king. So clearly there's a movement going on here in the Middle East. I'm not sure how related it is to Ukraine and Russia, probably not, much more related to Iran. However, you can work on the sidelines, you can find the ways and means of moving forward in conflict-riddled areas, despite the fact that the conflict still exists. I think a lot of the onus is still on Israel. This is my personal point of view, and I stress my personal point of view. I think at the end of the day, we absolutely must, we have to, under all circumstances, find a way to move forward with the Palestinians. There'll be a ceiling, a glass ceiling, which we won't be able to move forward. But not only because of that, I think it's because of our children and their children and our children's children. If we don't find a way of moving forward quickly or soon with the Palestinian Authority, with the Palestinian people, and they have to as well, under the auspices of what I said, the compromise, negotiation, discussion, etc. We're doomed for conflict for many years to come. And so I am a firm believer and actually very active in this field here in Israel since I retired from the foreign ministry. I'm a free agent.
Yes, thank you very much. There were a couple of more questions, but I think we need to wrap it up, don't we, John?
We do indeed. We've got 1 minute.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank you most sincerely on behalf of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, Mark, for your very enlightening talk. It does explain a lot. It meets some of the criticism, in fact, all of the criticism that's been raised against Israel from some quarters, including, I think, The Economist earlier this year, an article headed "Get Off the Fence," which was, I think, somewhat pointed. Israel is balancing on their fence, and you've explained exactly why that should be. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
John, I think you wanted to close off, did you?
Just thank you, Malcolm, and thank you, Mark. It's been 3 years since you were physically here in Perth giving a lecture, so it's a pleasure to have you as part of the AICC this year. We could go on for another hour, but we won't do that. We'll close by quickly saying to the audience, please keep connected with us. We're getting more digital every week, thanks to our increase in team here. Just quickly, the next event is on the 25th of August. You'll see Michael Mosley, the popular British doctor, journalist, and diabetes researcher, will be beamed in from London, and we'll have a large audience at the Hyatt, pressing flesh at the table and networking while he's speaking to us like we were today, with interaction with the audience. And that's already supported by some wonderful people: Parent Institute, Royal Perth Medical Hospital Foundation, Ramsay Health, Linear, Solaris Care, Bendigo Bank, Curtin University. So thank you. I would love to see you to take a table at that event. And following that, that's on the 25th of August. It's an after-work event, and then we have the Australian Chief Scientist, Kathy Foley, on the 15th of November for a major business luncheon on Women of Achievement, our Dr. Patricia Kalis series, and thanks to Dr. Maria and Amanda and to George Kalis, they've allowed us to continue that popular event, and it will be at EY at lunchtime, thanks to Curtin University and EY and Lemonade for supporting that event. To all of you, stay tuned with us on our website, and we will see you in the future. Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you, Mark, so much. And I wish you a very good day.
Thank you.